This is the story of the Vietnam War, a conflict often called one of the most brutal wars in modern history. In this full Vietnam War documentary, we will trace its causes, its battles, and its legacy. Please like, comment, and share if you want others to see this. In the 19th century, the great powers of Europe cast their gaze across Asia, searching for territories to control, ports to secure, and wealth to extract. Among them, France saw the fertile valleys of the Red River and Mekong, the rice fields, and the rubber plantations of Vietnam as a jewel to be claimed. By the mid-1800s, French troops had marched into Indochina, imposing their authority with cannons and warships. For the Vietnamese, this was not simply a conquest. It was the beginning of decades of subjugation under an alien rule that sought to reorder their society. French administrators built roads, railways, and ports not to serve the people, but to funnel resources outward. Vast tracts of land were seized and turned into plantations, worked by Vietnamese peasants whose labor enriched Paris but left them in poverty. Taxes were levied heavily, often collected in rice, forcing families into debt. Catholic missionaries, protected by colonial troops, spread their influence, while French schools taught a new elite in the colonizers' language. A generation of Vietnamese grew up speaking French, reading French literature, and learning French laws, while the vast majority remained bound to the fields. To the French, this was civilizing a backward land. To the Vietnamese, it was the erosion of their traditions, culture, and autonomy. The colonial government ruled with a sharp divide between master and subject. High offices were reserved for Europeans, while Vietnamese officials were confined to minor posts. Local resistance was met with swift punishment. Villages burned, rebels executed, and dissent silenced. Yet beneath the surface, anger simmered. By the early 20th century, a new idea began to take root among young Vietnamese intellectuals studying abroad. They encountered nationalism in China, socialism in France, and the global currents of anti-colonial thought. They returned with a burning conviction that Vietnam, too, deserved to stand free. The French colonial system had built railways, but these tracks also carried whispers of revolt. It had introduced new schools, but these classrooms produced men and women who would one day challenge its rule. In the very structures of empire, the seeds of its destruction were being sown. As the decades passed, these seeds would grow into movements, organizations, and revolts, each crushed, yet each leaving behind a spark. It was within this colonial shadow that the story of modern Vietnam begins, a land waiting for the moment when it would rise against the weight of empire. The shadow of France lay heavy across Vietnam, but the early 20th century stirred with voices that would not be silenced. Revolts flared sporadically, peasants taking up farm tools against rifles, secret societies plotting in dimly lit rooms, students whispering of liberation. Each rebellion was crushed, yet each defeat fed the memory of resistance into a collective consciousness. Among the rising generation was a young man named Viet Cong, later known as Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890 to a poor scholar's family in central Vietnam, he witnessed firsthand the indignities of colonial rule. His father was dismissed from office for resisting French authority, and his family was pushed into hardship. At an early age, Ho carried with him the sting of injustice and the dream of independence. Unlike many who fought only within Vietnam's borders, Ho set out into the wider world. He worked as a cook on ships, crossing oceans to Africa, America, and Europe. In Harlem, he saw the struggles of Black Americans. In Paris, he joined socialist circles, studying Marx and Lenin, and absorbing the idea that colonialism was a form of global exploitation. When World War I ended in 1919, Ho Chi Minh petitioned the victorious Allied leaders at Versailles, asking that Vietnam's right to self-determination be recognized. His plea was ignored. For Ho, and for countless colonized peoples, It was a bitter lesson that freedom would not be granted by foreign powers, but must be seized. Back home, nationalist groups were gathering strength. The Vietnamese Nationalist Party, VNQDD, inspired by Chinese revolutionaries, plotted assassinations and uprisings in the late 1920s. In 1930, a mutiny by Vietnamese soldiers at Dien was brutally suppressed. Its leaders were executed, its followers imprisoned. The lesson was clear: nationalist rebellion without broad support would be crushed mercilessly. Ho Chi Minh, now a seasoned revolutionary, understood this. He founded the Indochinese Communist Party, blending Marxist ideology with the Vietnamese struggle for independence. Unlike earlier movements, his vision looked beyond the educated elite. He spoke directly to peasants and workers, those who had borne the heaviest burdens of colonial exploitation. During the 1930s, Ho worked from exile in China and the Soviet Union, building networks and training cadres. The communists focused on land reform, literacy, and organization at the village level. Slowly, in the rice paddies and mountain hamlets, they began weaving together a political fabric that no colonial power could easily tear apart. By the outbreak of the Second World War, these seeds of resistance were ready to grow. The French had exploited Vietnam for decades, but a new storm was coming, one that would shatter their grip and open the door for revolution. In the chaos of global war, Vietnam would seize its chance. When the Second World War erupted, the balance of power in Asia shifted. In 1940, France itself was defeated by Nazi Germany, and its colonies became vulnerable. Into this vacuum stepped Imperial Japan, whose armies swept across Southeast Asia. Vietnam, long under French colonial rule, now found itself occupied by two masters: the French administrators who clung to power under Vichy collaboration, and the Japanese military that stripped the land for its own war machine. For the Vietnamese people, the burden was unbearable. Rice, the lifeblood of the country, was seized to feed Japanese troops and shipped abroad. Floods struck the northern plains, and colonial mismanagement turned disaster into catastrophe. By 1945, famine stalked the land. In the villages of Tonkin, peasants starved in the tens of thousands. Some estimates placed the death toll as high as 2 million souls. Entire families collapsed in the fields, while rice storehouses stood guarded by soldiers. In this crucible of suffering, resistance gained strength. Ho Chi Minh and his followers formed the Viet Minh, a coalition united not only by communist ideals, but by the simple call for independence. They fought as guerrillas in the jungles and mountains, striking Japanese outposts, sabotaging supply lines, and rallying villagers to their cause. To the starving and dispossessed, the Viet Minh became a symbol of hope. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, its empire in Asia collapsed overnight. Across Vietnam, power lay abandoned, waiting to be seized. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh moved swiftly. In Hanoi, crowds filled the streets, waving banners, shouting slogans, demanding freedom. On September 2, 1945, before a vast gathering in Ba Dinh Square, Ho proclaimed the independence of Vietnam, quoting the American Declaration of Independence: "All men are created equal." But independence would not come so easily. The Allies, wary of communist influence, allowed French troops to return, determined to restore their colony. What followed was a bitter and protracted struggle. The First Indochina War began in 1946. French forces, heavily armed and supported by American funding, sought to crush the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh, in turn, waged a relentless guerrilla campaign, ambushing convoys, striking garrisons, then vanishing into the jungles. Battles were fought not only with weapons, but with propaganda, as each side sought to claim the loyalty of the people. The war dragged on for years, grinding down both sides. French commanders, frustrated by an elusive enemy, turned to brutal tactics, such as bombing villages, interning suspects, and attempting to starve out resistance. Yet the Viet Minh endured, supported by the peasantry, supplied increasingly by China after 1949, and guided by the determination of leaders who believed time itself was on their side. The climax came in 1954 at a remote valley in the northwest known as Dien Bien Phu. The French, believing they could lure the Viet Minh into a decisive battle, fortified the valley with artillery, bunkers, and paratroopers. What they did not anticipate was the ingenuity of their enemy. Under the command of General Von Nguyen Giap, tens of thousands of Viet Minh soldiers dragged heavy artillery through mountains and jungles, piece by piece, sometimes by hand, sometimes by bicycle. They dug an elaborate network of trenches that crept closer and closer to the French positions. When the siege began, the French found themselves surrounded. Their airstrips destroyed, their supply lines cut, they were trapped in a cauldron of fire. For 55 days, the battle raged. French forces, once the masters of Indochina, were pounded into exhaustion. On May 7, 1954, their garrison surrendered. It was a stunning victory of an Asian nationalist army defeating a European colonial power on the battlefield. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu reverberated across the world. For France, it marked the end of its empire in Indochina. For Vietnam, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would pit Vietnamese against Vietnamese, communism against capitalism, in a war that was only just beginning. The fall of Dien Bien Phu shook the colonial world to its core. Never before had a European power been so decisively defeated by a nationalist army in Asia. Across the globe, it became a symbol of an empire undone. But for Vietnam, victory brought not unity, but division. In July 1954, diplomats from the great powers gathered in Geneva to decide the fate of Indochina. Around the table sat representatives from France, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, and the United States. Absent were the Vietnamese themselves, whose future was being debated by others. The Geneva Accords brought an uneasy compromise. Vietnam would be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. In the north, the Viet Minh, under Ho Chi Minh, would govern from Hanoi. In the south, a new state would be formed under Western influence. Within 2 years, nationwide elections were promised to reunify the country. For Ho Chi Minh, who had dreamed of independence for decades, this was a bitter pill. He accepted the partition only as a temporary step, confident that free elections would deliver him power. But in Washington and Saigon, the calculations were different. The United States, already locked in the global rivalry of the Cold War, saw Vietnam not as a local struggle, but as a battleground in the fight against communism. The fear was not simply of Vietnam falling to Ho Chi Minh, but of a wider cascade of his so-called domino theory. If Vietnam turned communist, they believed, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and perhaps even all of Southeast Asia would follow. Determined to prevent this, the Americans moved swiftly to construct a bulwark in the South. They backed the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist nationalist, who became Prime Minister of the newly created Republic of Vietnam. Diem, a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, was hailed in Washington as the miracle man who would stand against communism. But beneath the surface, the new state was fragile. Diem relied on family members and loyalists rather than broad support. Corruption spread through the government, while rural peasants, who formed the vast majority of the population, saw little change in their lives. In the countryside, resentment grew. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh consolidated power. Land reform campaigns redistributed property from landlords to peasants, often through brutal means. Political opponents were silenced, and a one-party state emerged. Yet the Viet Minh's victory at Dien Bien Phu and their stance against colonialism gave Ho an enduring legitimacy among many Vietnamese. Thus, by the mid-1950s, Vietnam stood divided into two rival states. each claiming to be the true government of a single nation. Between them lay the 17th parallel, guarded by ceasefire lines and international observers. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Neither side intended for the partition to be permanent. Both were prepared for the struggle that was coming. The Cold War had planted its flag in Vietnam. What had begun as a war against colonial rule was now being transformed into something larger, a contest between superpowers fought on Vietnamese soil. The world's eyes were turning toward a country of rice paddies and jungles, where the next great confrontation of the 20th century was about to unfold. In the wake of Geneva, the United States pinned its hopes on the fragile new state south of the 17th parallel. Here, in Saigon, they sought to build a nation that would stand as a bulwark against communism in Asia. At its center was Diem, a man Washington believed could be molded into the leader Vietnam needed. Diem had spent years in exile, moving through Catholic seminaries and political circles abroad. To American officials, his rigid anti-communism and personal austerity seemed virtues. President Eisenhower called him the miracle man of Asia. In 1955, with American backing, Diem consolidated power, toppling the remnants of the French-backed monarchy and declaring the Republic of Vietnam, with himself as president. But the state Diem inherited was weak, fractured, and riddled with problems. South Vietnam contained a mosaic of religious groups, political factions, and armed militias Chow Dai, Hoa Hao, and powerful criminal syndicates in Saigon. Through force, patronage, and American support, Diem brought them to heel, building a centralized authority. For a brief moment, Washington celebrated. South Vietnam appeared stable, and Diem was hailed as a new hope. But beneath the surface, his rule sowed seeds of discontent. Diem's government was deeply authoritarian. Elections were staged but tightly controlled, yielding implausible victories of more than 90%. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, where loyalty to the president's family counted for more than competence. His brother, Dien New, and his sister-in-law, Madame New, became notorious for their influence, arrogance, and disdain for opponents. In the countryside, where most Vietnamese lived, the government's reach was weak. Peasants still struggled under crushing poverty, burdened by land inequality. Diem's policies, favoring large landowners and Catholic elites, alienated the Buddhist majority. Villagers who had once admired the Viet Minh for standing against colonialism now found themselves harassed by Diem's officials, taxed heavily, and denied reforms. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and his government watched closely. When it became clear that elections promised by the Geneva Accords would never be held, the Americans and Diem feared Ho would win easily, and the North shifted strategy. They began supporting insurgency in the South, encouraging former Viet Minh fighters to rise again. By the late 1950s, attacks on government outposts, assassinations of local officials, and acts of sabotage spread across the countryside. What began as scattered resistance soon coalesced into an organized movement, the National Liberation Front, known to the Americans as the Viet Cong. South Vietnam, born under the promise of American protection, was already in peril. Diem's government, isolated from its people and sustained by foreign aid, faced an enemy that was patient, rooted in the villages, and growing stronger with each passing year. The stage was set for escalation. What had begun as a struggle between two Vietnamese states was about to draw in the full weight of the United States and transform into a war unlike any America had fought before. In Washington, policymakers watched the events in Southeast Asia with growing alarm. The Cold War was a global chessboard, and Vietnam appeared to be one of its most fragile squares. The fall of China to communism in 1949 had already shocked American leaders. Then, in 1950, North Korea's invasion of the South convinced them that communism was not only spreading, but advancing with military force. To many in Washington, Vietnam looked like the next target in a relentless chain of conquests. It was here that the phrase domino theory took hold. First articulated by President Dwight Eisenhower in 1954, it warned that if one nation in Asia fell to communism, others would topple in rapid succession: Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, even Indonesia. Soon, the theory suggested, the entire region would be painted red. To those inside the Pentagon and State Department, Vietnam was not just about Vietnam. It was about credibility, alliances, and the perception of strength. America had pledged to contain communism. To lose South Vietnam would not only risk Asia, it would signal weakness to allies in Europe and the Middle East. This logic bound the United States ever tightly to Saigon. Billions of dollars in aid poured into South Vietnam, funding its military, its infrastructure, and its fragile institutions. Advisors arrived in increasing numbers, training and equipping an army that Washington hoped could resist the growing insurgency. But the strategy carried its own blindness. The domino theory reduced Vietnam to an abstraction, a piece in the global struggle between Washington and Moscow. Few in the corridors of American power stopped to ask whether the villagers in the Mekong Delta or the Central Highlands saw their struggle in such terms. By the end of the 1950s, the insurgency in South Vietnam had intensified. Diem's repression only deepened rural resentment, while Northern support funneled men and weapons into the South. To counter this, American officials pressed for stronger measures, convinced that only force could hold the line. In the forests and rice paddies of Vietnam, a new kind of war was beginning to unfold, a shadow war of ambushes, assassinations, and propaganda. To the Vietnamese, it was a continuation of their long fight for independence and unity. To the United States, it was the next test in a global struggle. The dominoes, they believed, were trembling, and America would not allow the first one to fall. In the villages of South Vietnam, war took on a shape unlike the battles of the world wars. There were no clear front lines, no sweeping campaigns of tanks and divisions. Instead, it was a struggle for control of the countryside, fought in shadows, rice paddies, and dense forests. By 1960, the insurgents, organized as the National Liberation Front, but called the Viet Cong by their enemies, were spreading their reach. They were not foreign invaders, but often sons of the soil, men and women who lived among the villagers, worked the fields by day, and fought by night. Their presence blurred the line between civilian and soldier, between neighbor and foe. The Viet Cong relied on guerrilla warfare, a style of fighting designed to exploit weakness and patience. Small units struck suddenly, ambushing patrols, sabotaging bridges, assassinating village chiefs loyal to Saigon, and then melted back into the jungle. Each attack chipped away at the government's authority, replacing it with their own. American advisors, now numbering in the thousands, found themselves in a war they could barely comprehend. South Vietnamese forces, trained in conventional tactics, struggled against an enemy that would not stand and fight in open battle. Victories on paper meant little, for the Viet Cong could disappear, only to return when the soldiers withdrew. The countryside became a battlefield of allegiance. By day, government officials might raise the flag of Saigon in a village square. By night, cadres of the Viet Cong arrived to punish collaborators and recruit new fighters. For many peasants, survival meant shifting loyalty depending on who held the most immediate power. What gave the Viet Cong their strength was not only their tactics, but the sense of purpose they carried. They spoke of liberation, of land reform, of ending the corruption of Diem's regime. And from the north came steady support. Weapons, supplies, and training flowed down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of hidden paths running through Laos and Cambodia, threading through mountains and forests, invisible from the sky. The Americans saw the conflict in the number of villages pacified, insurgents killed, and rifles supplied to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. But numbers could not capture the intangible, the resilience of fighters who believed they were waging a just struggle, and the fear among peasants caught between two ruthless powers. By the early 1960s, it was clear that the South Vietnamese government was losing control of its own countryside. Saigon might rule the cities, but in the villages, under the bamboo groves, and in the flooded rice fields, the Viet Cong were becoming the real authority. The war, once small and hidden, was growing. Soon, the United States would face a choice: watch its ally collapse, or step into the quagmire with its own soldiers. By the early 1960s, the cracks in South Vietnam's fragile state had widened into fractures. Ngo Diem, once hailed by Washington as a miracle leader, had become an obstacle to the very stability he was supposed to ensure. His rule had grown increasingly authoritarian. Power was concentrated in his family's hands, while corruption seeped through the bureaucracy. Villagers, already weary of poverty, land inequality, and constant insecurity, saw little benefit from his government. The insurgency fed on this discontent, presenting itself as the champion of the rural poor. But it was religion that brought Diem's downfall into sharp focus. A devout Catholic ruling a largely Buddhist nation, Diem granted privileges to his co-religionists while restricting Buddhist practices. In 1963, his regime banned the display of Buddhist flags during Vesak, the holiday marking the birth of the Buddha. Protests erupted, swelling into nationwide demonstrations. The world watched in horror as Diem's security forces cracked down. In June of that year, a Buddhist monk named Tet Quang Duc walked into a busy Saigon intersection, sat calmly, and set himself ablaze. The image of his burning body, silent, unmoving, as flames consumed him, was carried across newspapers worldwide. It became a symbol of a regime deaf to its people and blind to the crisis within. In Washington, confidence in Diem collapsed. American officials had once defended him as a bulwark against communism, but now he seemed a liability. His rigidity, his reliance on family members, and his violent suppression of dissent alienated the very population whose loyalty was essential for survival. By autumn 1963, whispers of a coup circulated in Saigon. The United States, unwilling to stop it, gave tacit approval. On November 1st, South Vietnamese generals moved. Tanks and troops surrounded the presidential palace, and Diem, with his brother Ngo, fled through secret tunnels. The following day, they were captured and executed in the back of an armored personnel carrier. The Americans had supported his rise, and now they had looked away at his fall. Yet Diem's removal solved little. His regime had been corrupt and repressive, but his death left South Vietnam unstable and adrift. A carousel of generals and leaders followed, none able to secure legitimacy or halt the Viet Cong's advance. What had begun as a strategy to strengthen Saigon instead deepened its chaos. The United States, rather than withdrawing, would find itself drawn ever deeper into the power vacuum it had helped create. The fall of Ngo Diem was not the end of a problem, but the opening of a darker chapter, one that would soon demand direct American intervention on a scale no one in Washington had yet imagined. The death of Ngo Diem left South Vietnam in turmoil. Leadership passed from one set of generals to another, each coup promising stability, each failing to deliver it. In the countryside, the Viet Cong tightened their grip, moving freely through villages and jungles, extending their shadow over much of the South. In Washington, the problem now belonged to a new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who assumed office after John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, inherited a war sliding out of control. Johnson, a man of towering ambition, saw America's credibility as indivisible from its commitment in Vietnam. If the United States faltered here, he feared, its enemies would doubt its resolve everywhere. By 1964, the insurgency was advancing, South Vietnam's government remained fractured, and the American presence had swelled to over 16,000 advisors. Yet the war was still fought in the shadows, and Johnson's administration sought a justification to escalate. That moment arrived in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. destroyer, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, amid bad weather and confused signals, radar operators claimed a second attack was underway. In truth, that second attack almost certainly never happened. But the incident was enough. President Johnson seized the moment. He addressed the American public with solemn urgency, insisting that U.S. forces had been victims of unprovoked aggression. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting Johnson sweeping powers to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. With that, America's limited engagement transformed into an open-ended commitment. The resolution became a blank check, and Johnson intended to cash it. Soon after, U.S. aircraft struck targets in North Vietnam. Advisors gave way to combat troops. What had once been a war fought by the Vietnamese, with American assistance, was now becoming an American war fought on Vietnamese soil. Yet in 1964, few understood the scale of what was beginning. Johnson promised no wider war, even as he prepared to send tens of thousands of troops across the Pacific. For Washington, the Gulf of Tonkin was a moment of resolve. For Vietnam, it was the threshold of a catastrophe that would engulf both nations. The domino theory, the credibility of U.S. power, and the political calculations of one president had set the stage. The war was no longer an insurgency. It was about to become a full-scale conflict, one in which the world's most powerful military would collide with a determined, elusive enemy. In February 1965, following a Viet Cong attack on an American base at Pleiku, the United States crossed a line it could never retreat from. President Lyndon Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. What began as limited retaliation expanded into one of the most relentless aerial bombardments in history. For 3 years, wave after wave of American aircraft pounded bridges, roads, supply depots, and industrial centers. The aim was to cripple the North's ability to sustain the insurgency in the South, to break its will, and force Hanoi to abandon its campaign of unification. Yet the results fell short of their promise. The North Vietnamese dispersed their industry, concealed supply lines, and repaired bombed roads within days. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, winding through Laos and Cambodia, proved impossible to sever. Each bomb crater was filled, each destroyed bridge replaced by a dozen makeshift crossings. American firepower devastated the landscape, but it did not break the determination of those who endured it. Meanwhile, Johnson escalated on the ground. In March 1965, the first combat troop, U.S. Marin E., landed at Da Nang. By the end of the year, nearly 200,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. By 1968, more than 500,000 would be deployed. This was the Americanization of the war, where once the U.S. had played the role of advisor and financier, now it bore the weight of the fighting itself. Massive bases rose across South Vietnam, bristling with helicopters, artillery, and mechanized infantry. Search and destroy missions swept through the countryside, seeking to root out the Viet Cong and annihilate them with overwhelming force. But victory remained elusive. The Americans measured success in body counts, tallying enemy dead as proof of progress. Yet for every fighter killed, more seemed to emerge from the jungles and villages. The Viet Cong avoided large-scale battles, striking suddenly, then disappearing into terrain they knew intimately. The war's brutality fell most heavily on civilians. Villages suspected of aiding the insurgents were burned, rice stores destroyed, and populations uprooted into strategic hamlets. Napalm and cluster bombs scarred the land, while civilians caught between the hammer of American firepower and the knife of Viet Cong reprisals lived in a state of perpetual terror. As American involvement deepened, so did the cost. Coffins draped in flags returned home in growing numbers, and the promise of a quick, decisive victory began to fade. Rolling Thunder had been meant to force Hanoi to the table. Instead, it hardened their resolve. The North Vietnamese understood that they did not need to defeat the United States outright. They only needed to endure, to outlast the will of a distant power whose soldiers did not fight for their own soil. By 1966, America was fully committed. The greatest military power on earth had entered the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, believing it could bend a nation through sheer force. But the war they faced was not one of clear battles and front lines. It was a war of patience, attrition, and exhaustion, and it was only just beginning. The war in Vietnam was not fought on open plains or city streets, but in jungles, swamps, and villages where heat, insects, and disease proved as relentless as the enemy. For those who lived and fought there, daily survival was a battle of its own. For American soldiers, Vietnam was a world far removed from home. The humidity soaked their uniforms, jungle rot spread across their feet, and the cries of unseen birds and insects echoed through the night. Patrols moved cautiously, eyes scanning the trees and undergrowth, every step haunted by the fear of landmines, punji traps, or an ambush. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers lived under harsher conditions still. They marched along hidden trails with heavy packs, sleeping in hammocks or underground bunkers, often with little food. Entire networks of tunnels stretched beneath the countryside, allowing fighters to emerge suddenly, strike, and vanish again into the earth. These tunnels, dark, airless, crawling with insects, were homes, hospitals, and command centers all at once. For villagers, life was a fragile balance. Their homes lay in the crossfire of two enemies, each demanding loyalty. At dawn, government troops might search their homes, demanding intelligence or conscripting young men. At night, the Viet Cong arrived, punishing collaborators, collecting rice, and weaving their influence into village life. To survive often meant shifting allegiances, concealing one's true loyalties, and living in constant fear. The Americans brought modern firepower, helicopters thundering overhead, napalm streaking the sky, ND artillery flattening suspected strongholds. Yet the more they struck, the more they alienated the population they sought to win. Each burned village, each civilian casualty, drove more families into the arms of the insurgency. Daily routines revealed the vast gulf between the two sides. American soldiers rotated out after a year, counting the days on calendars scratched into helmets. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, there was no rotation, no end in sight. They fought with the knowledge that their families lived under the same skies, that the outcome of the war would decide the future of their homeland. War shaped the landscape as much as the people. Defoliants like Agent Orange stripped the jungles bare, poisoning soil and rivers, leaving scars that would endure for generations. Helicopter blades churned the air, turning remote valleys into killing fields. And still, beneath the shattered trees and cratered earth, the rhythm of life continued. Rice planted, harvests gathered, children born into a world of gunfire. For both soldier and civilian, the war blurred boundaries. No place was safe, no line between battlefield and home remained. Vietnam itself had become the battlefield, and its people bore the weight of a struggle that seemed endless. In early 1968, as the Lunar New Year approached, both sides paused to prepare for the traditional holiday of Tet, when families gathered, fires were lit, and temples filled with incense. For weeks, American commanders assured the public that victory was near, pointing to rising enemy body counts and villages secured by their forces. The war, they said, was being won. But in the forests and tunnels of Vietnam, the Communists prepared something else. Under the command of General von Nguyen Giap, they assembled tens of thousands of fighters in secret, moving them into cities, towns, and villages across the country. Their aim was not to win the war outright, but to shatter the illusion of American progress, to strike where the enemy felt strongest. On January 30th, 1968, the first attacks began. Within hours, more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam erupted in coordinated assault. Saigon itself was struck, its streets echoing with gunfire. In the capital, guerrillas stormed the U.S. Embassy compound, breaching the walls and fighting room to room before being killed. Across the country, provincial capitals, bases, and government outposts were overrun. The fiercest fighting raged in Hue, the old imperial capital. For weeks, communist forces held the city, raising their flag above its ancient citadel. Street by street, house by house, American and South Vietnamese troops fought to retake it, leaving the city in ruins. When Hue finally fell, mass graves were uncovered, hundreds of civilians executed by communist cadres accused of collaboration. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was costly for the North. Tens of thousands of fighters were killed, their hope of sparking a nationwide uprising unfulfilled. Yet strategically, it was a triumph. The offensive revealed that the war was far from over, that the enemy remained capable of striking at will, even in the heart of South Vietnam cities. For Americans watching at home, the impact was seismic. Television brought images of burning buildings, desperate firefights, and soldiers fighting not in distant jungles, but in city streets. The war no longer looked like a struggle edging toward victory. It looked endless. Confidence collapsed. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, declared that the war was a stalemate. President Johnson, once defiant, confessed privately, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Tet marked the turning point. Though the United States and its allies had beaten back the offensive, the psychological blow was devastating. The illusion of progress was shattered, and the question now was no longer how to win the war, but how to leave it. The Tet Offensive had shaken America to its core. In its aftermath, President Lyndon Johnson stunned the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. Into this fractured landscape stepped Richard Nixon, a man who promised both peace and honor. His pledge was simple. He would end the war, but not in defeat. Nixon's strategy became known as Vietnamization. The plan was to gradually withdraw American troops while equipping and training the South Vietnamese army to take over the fighting. It was meant to shift the burden of the war back onto Saigon while preserving America's credibility abroad. At first, it seemed like a way out. Troop withdrawals began, and American families saw their sons returning from the jungles of Southeast Asia. Yet beneath this veneer of de-escalation, the war widened. To cut off the flow of men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Nixon ordered secret bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, countries officially neutral but now pulled into the conflict's orbit. In 1970, American and South Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia, igniting protests around the world. At home, campuses erupted in fury, culminating in the tragedy at Kent State University, where National Guard troops shot dead 4 unarmed students. The war, once distant, had come home to American soil. In Vietnam, the policy of Vietnamization faltered. Despite modern weapons and training, the South Vietnamese army struggled with corruption, desertion, and low morale. Many soldiers lacked the motivation to fight for a government that remained divided and unpopular. In contrast, North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong endured, hardened by years of struggle, sustained by support from Moscow and Beijing. Nixon, determined to negotiate from strength, authorized the most intense bombing of the war. In December 1972, the skies over Hanoi and Haiphong roared with the thunder of Operation Linebacker II, a campaign meant to bring North Vietnam to the table by sheer destruction. Neighborhoods were flattened, civilians killed in the thousands, yet Hanoi endured. At last, diplomacy moved. In Paris, after years of talks marked by walkouts and deadlocks, an agreement was reached. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. They promised a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American troops, the return of prisoners of war, and a fragile coexistence between North and South. For the United States, it marked the end of direct involvement. The last combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973. For Richard Nixon, it was declared a peace with honor. But beneath the banners and speeches, the truth was darker. The war had not ended. It had merely been handed back to the Vietnamese, and the fate of South Vietnam hung by a thread. When the last American troops departed in 1973, the war did not end. The Paris Peace Accords existed only on paper. In the jungles and cities of Vietnam, fighting continued almost without pause. Both North and South accused each other of violations, and both were correct. For a time, South Vietnam held on, sustained by U.S. aid and air power. But beneath the surface, its weaknesses deepened. Corruption hollowed out its government. Inflation drained its economy, and its army, large on paper, struggled with morale and desertion. Without American combat forces beside them, the burden was too heavy. In Hanoi, the North waited patiently. Supplies from the Soviet Union and China flowed steadily, while divisions were rebuilt and prepared. By 1975, with American support dwindling and Washington distracted by the Watergate scandal that had consumed Nixon, the moment arrived. In March, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive. One city after another collapsed with astonishing speed. Panic swept through the South Vietnamese army, units abandoning posts, refugees flooding highways. Entire provinces fell without resistance. The United States, unwilling to return to full-scale war, could only watch. By April, the enemy was at the gates of Saigon. Inside the capital, chaos reigned. Tens of thousands of desperate civilians crowded the streets, begging for escape. American helicopters thundered overhead in a frantic evacuation. At the U.S. Embassy, scenes of desperation unfolded. Vietnamese allies clawing at gates, families torn apart, as the last helicopters lifted from the rooftop. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through Saigon streets. One crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, where South Vietnam's leaders surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. For the United States, it was a humiliation unlike any in its history. More than 58,000 Americans had died, hundreds of thousands wounded, and a superpower had failed to impose its will on a small, divided nation. For Vietnam, the cost was immeasurable. Millions dead, villages destroyed, forests poisoned, a land scarred by decades of war. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam was unified at last under communist rule. Yet the victory was bittersweet. The country it inherited lay in ruins, its people exhausted, its future uncertain. The fall of Saigon marked not just the end of a war, but the end of an era. America's invincibility had been broken, and the Cold War had entered a new, uncertain phase. For Vietnam, the long dream of unity had been achieved, but at a price so staggering it would echo for generations. When the guns fell silent in 1975, Vietnam stood whole for the first time in generations. But it was a unity carved from devastation. Cities lay shattered, fields were poisoned by chemicals, and villages were erased from maps. The war had killed an estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese, alongside tens of thousands of Laotians and Cambodians. Its scars ran deeper than the bodies buried. They lingered in the forests where Agent Orange stripped the land bare, and in the quiet villages where generations of families were gone. The new Socialist Republic of Vietnam inherited victory, but also famine, poverty, and international isolation. Western powers imposed sanctions, while relations with China, once all, soon soured. The people who had survived decades of occupation and conflict now faced the challenge of rebuilding a nation that war had almost annihilated. For America, the defeat in Vietnam reshaped its soul. Over 58,000 Americans dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and an entire generation haunted by images broadcast nightly on television screens. The nation's confidence was shaken, its leaders more cautious in the use of force abroad. The Vietnam Syndrome became a phrase for an unwillingness to be drawn into another long, unwinnable war. Beyond borders, the Vietnam War altered the Cold War itself. Allies questioned U.S. resolve. Enemies learned that even a superpower could be bled by guerrilla resistance. For countries caught between Washington and Moscow, Vietnam became a warning of what proxy wars could unleash. Yet perhaps the deepest legacy lay in memory. For the Vietnamese who fought, whether in the jungles for the North or in the crumbling defenses of the South, it was a story of unimaginable sacrifice. For Americans, it became a story of disillusionment, of young lives lost in rice paddies far from home, and of a society divided against itself. Decades later, the war is remembered not only in battlefields and memorials, but in the silence of survivors who still carry its weight. Vietnam has risen, its cities now alive with commerce, and its people young again. But the shadows of the war remain in the land, in the bloodlines, and in the lessons carved into history. The Vietnam War was not merely a conflict between two nations or two ideologies. It was a crucible in which the limits of power, the cost of ambition, and the endurance of a people were tested. And in the end, it left a truth that neither victory nor defeat can erase. That war consumes, but its echoes never fade. The Vietnam War explained in detail leaves us with a truth that victory and defeat cannot erase. That war consumes, but its legacy never fades. This was the Vietnam War, its causes, its timeline, its battles, and its aftermath.